All right, ladies and gentlemen, I know I keep saying that I'm going to do ethics next, but we actually still have a little more, maybe more than a little more, metaphysical heavy lifting to do before I get into that. I guess it's a good thing that I allow enough time between videos to really ruminate on things, because then I start thinking of things I need to either clarify, elaborate on more, or additional things that I didn't consider in previous videos. So let's unpack this a little bit more with Jorjani. So one thing I want to clarify about my own view is I keep repeating over and over that I've discarded this whole dualistic conception of the divine, to the point where I have no longer just rejected Christianity, but that means I've got to reject Platonism, Dharma, perennialism, because all of it is largely reliant on Plato's metaphysic. This duality between the transcendent eternal realm and the realm of shadows and copies, which I'm not going to go into again. We've already explained it several times, why I reject that, why it's dualistic, why it doesn't work. So, but I keep also at the same time saying that God has a mind. So God has a body and God has a mind, which we're calling his spirit or his nous. And so somebody may be going, okay, you don't believe that there are eternal forms in the mind of God, but you reject that whole idea, but you still believe God has a mind. So what's in his mind? Does he have ideas? Does he have thoughts? When I say mind, when I talk about the divine mind, I am chiefly thinking in terms of God having metacognition, God being having pure awareness, being aware of himself, of his person, of his identity as a person, as a divine person, self-awareness. Okay, I'm not thinking in terms of God having ideas in his mind that he then brings into manifestation in this so-called finite realm that are just that consist primarily of copies or shadows of the real thing that exists in his mind. I'm not thinking that way at all, but it's still important to understand that God does have a mind. Okay, so I just want to clarify that, because someone might be going, well, how is it you're rejecting the forms which are predicated on ideas being in God's mind, but you still have God with a mind? All right, so having clarified that, the next point I wanted to make, let's see. Okay, I want to revisit something I brought up in my first ever video on Jorjani, which was not part of this series. It was a standalone video. Jorjani wants to dispense with the concept of God totally, right? His eternal flux is just the way things are. And there's no use in his mind explaining that in terms of a personal God or a divinity or anything of that nature. This flux has just been doing what it's been doing without beginning, and it will do it without end. It will continue to, as he puts it, spin off or generate shapes and forms, not in the Platonic sense, but just shapes. He'll keep generating more and more different life forms, different types of objects, and so on. And this infinite potential exists in the flux, and it will just continue to express itself that way. Now, I have that same view. It's just that I don't dispense with the notion of God, or God being a personal God. I say, on the contrary, God is personal, and there is a God, and it does work exactly the way he's saying, right? This has been going on forever. There's no beginning to it. There's no end to it. God's manifesting, God's acting to manifest is an intrinsic feature of what it is to be God. So it is not It is not the act of manifesting is not something. It's not optional. It's a permanent feature. It is who and what he is. Okay. Now, to revisit something I said before, in Jorjani's mind, the only way we can have, we humans, human persons, can have absolute freedom of choice and freedom of will is if there's no personal God. So, freedom of will is predicated on absolute autonomy. Absolute autonomy. Because in his mind, to be ontologically derivative of a superior being is to be subject to that being. Similar to the way the Jews were subject to Yahweh's law, or the way Christians are subject to the law of Christ, or whatever. And I'm saying that's not necessary to understand it that way. He says, if you have faith in a God, in the existence of a God, that God must know the end from the beginning. Therefore, there is a sense in which, regardless of what tradition you come out of, whether it's Platonism, Calvinism, perennialism, Dharma, whatever, that there is some sense in which God determines everything that takes place. And we are subject to that, just the forces of nature acting upon us. It is not necessary to draw that conclusion. And here's why. Number one, that assumes that there are two definitive bookends that sort of define the border of the human experience. That assumes that there are finite borders of human experience. And therefore, there's a fixed or definitive number of calculations that God would have to know in order to know the end from the beginning, in order to determine everything that happens. My contention is that if that's the way things are, as he describes it, then God would not in fact be infinite if he knew the end from the beginning. Because assuming that there is an end and a beginning assumes that there's a finite amount of information that God would need to know. But if God is infinite, then as I understand it, history goes on infinitely. The history of the cosmos goes on infinitely. creation, the act of creation, the act of manifestation goes on infinitely and has always gone on, has always occurred. So there was no beginning either. There was no beginning and there's no end. It's all consciousness acting within the eternity of God's experience. The infinite eternity of God's, the infinity and eternity of God's experience. Okay? If that's the case, then God could not know the end from the beginning, because there's no beginning and there's no end. Now, does that mean that, on the contrary, that God is finite because he doesn't know exactly how things are going to go, because they go on without end? Obviously, right? Because he couldn't have a definitive knowledge of he couldn't have a definitive foreknowledge if there's no termination to history, if there's no terminus to the actions that his creatures take and the decisions that his creatures take, and the sheer number of calculations that go into all that, without, endlessly. So to those who want to say that that's impossible because God could not be sovereign on that model, he absolutely is sovereign, because he is the one acting through everyone and through everything, because it is all his being. Creation, all of creation is his consciousness. We, as individual decision makers, we will things as iterations, as finite iterations of the totality of his being. Now, even though we are derivative of him, even though we derive from his being, we are not parts of God, in the sense that the person who tries to chisel a statue from a boulder and chisels different pieces of rock away from it in order to create the statue that he wants, we're not like the pieces of rock he's chiseling away. We're not parts of the boulder. We're not like the pieces of rock are parts of a boulder. We are parts of God in the sense that we derive our personhood from the supreme person. So ontologically, there is an identity. But in terms of the individual instantiation, i.e. myself, Jonathan, for example, that is absolutely unique, because there isn't a finite number of persons he can manifest. There's literally an infinite number of persons he can manifest, because he is not diminished in any way by manifesting souls, by manifesting persons, by manifesting anything. Being infinite, he can manifest an infinite number of things endlessly without diminishing himself. So every time he brings something or someone into existence, it has an absolutely unique place within the history of his divine experience, which means that that thing never existed prior to that moment and will never exist after that moment. So it's a paradox, but we are simultaneously localized finite instantiations of that same being, while in our localized manifestation we are absolutely unique and unrepeatable. So while God is acting through us and through creation as a whole, and therefore nothing can happen outside of him. Therefore, he is sovereign over everything and anything and everything and everyone. Even though in a sense he is directly acting, he is acting through individualized instantiations of himself that have absolute and unique freedom as absolute and unique identities, personal identities. So, I know I'm forgetting something here. I don't want to sign out without having made sure. Okay. Yeah, so there's one other thing I want to say then. I also want to, before closing this, I want to revisit what I talked about in the last video, where Jorjani says that his principle of unity is located in the dynamic tension that holds all of the forms or shapes that exist in the manifest realm together. Whether we are talking about his substance, out of which these individual shapes and forms are molded, whether we are talking about the substance itself or the shapes that emerge from that substance, it's all the one substance. It's all this generic consciousness in his mind, because there's nothing other than that. There's nothing other than consciousness. There's nothing other than this substance that he derives from the thought of Giordano Bruno and the other German philosopher. I can't remember his name. And as you recall, in principle, I agree with that the notion of there being a substance which has just an infinite spectrum. So that ideas and thoughts, so-called abstract things, exist on this spectrum, on this same spectrum that, rocks and stones are, right? What we call objective, concrete objects exist on the same spectrum that thoughts exist on. I agree with him on that, but he reduces everything to that substance. Okay, so naturally, because he's got an impersonal view of ultimate reality. What I failed to critique or mention in the last video, in terms of that particular point, was he actually distinguishes between the individual shapes themselves and the way that the greater concreteness that they take when they are made manifest. So he still distinguishes between a kind of potential manifestation and the manifestation itself. So the question for me then becomes, trying to figure out how to formulate this. It seems to me that his position would require that he simply believe the individualized shapes and forms have already existed from all eternity, the way they exist in the manifest. How does he explain? He talks about the unity of these individualized shapes in terms of dynamic tension, but what brings about the change from their potentialized individual existences and their finalized individual existences? Would he explain that in terms of will or volition, or, how is he understanding that? Because once you get into the realm of will and volition, it seems to me you're teetering dangerously on the brink of espousing personalism. Now, I even know some Kashmir Shaivists who deny divine personalism. There are many that would accept divine personalism. There are those like Christopher Wallace who deny that God is a person, mainly because he thinks that to espouse personhood, you'd have to think of God in terms of a subject-object duality, which that's not necessary. Just because that's the way it's presented in Abrahamic thought doesn't mean that you can't have a conception of God as personal, as a non-dualist. But leaving that aside, even though he rejects the personhood of God, he brings in concepts like will and volition. So once you bring that in, it seems to me you've got to bring in the concept of, you've got to recognize that there is a more basic distinction than just the distinction that exists between the oneness of the substance itself and the plurality of the individual shapes and forms that substance takes, or that substance already has. Because again, in his mind, it seems that they already exist. The shapes and forms already exist. They just don't exist yet in the way that they're going to exist after they are manifested, or as he puts it, Jorjani puts it, the way they exist after the flux spins them out. Okay, so there's got to be then a further distinction, a distinction between potentiality in the fullness of manifestation, which brings the idea of action to the fore. What or who is acting? And is it done volitionally, or is it just purely random, just randomness, pure randomness? We could go a lot deeper. We could go a lot deeper on this, but if I do, it's just going to go on and on and on. I don't know where to end this particular thread of thought, but my point is, he's got to establish what it is that distinguishes the state of these plural forms and shapes as they are prior to their final manifested state versus the fullness of their manifested state. What is that thing that does that? We can't just we can't just stop at the distinction between the oneness of the substance itself and the many forms that emerge from the substance. It's got to be more than just oneness versus manyness, because this is the same problem we critiqued when we were critiquing the Trinity. Otherwise, you're just going to end up with a duality between the notion of oneness and the notion of manyness. Plurality has to fit into oneness without being swallowed up by oneness to the point that there is no difference ultimately between the different forms and shapes themselves. They can't be reducible to the same thing. They've got to be absolutely unique. But it seems to me that if you have a completely impersonalized metaphysic, there's no reason why these unique shapes and forms shouldn't ultimately be reducible to the one substance, rather than being completely unique. And the only way, in my mind, to have utter uniqueness is for those things to be rooted in the being of a person, and not just in some generic substance. Okay, I don't know how helpful that was. Please let me know. If, at least those of you who are able to comprehend on this level some of the philosophical jargon and some of the technicalities and long trains of thought. Those of you who are able to do that, let me know if this is making any sense. If you comprehended it, and if I have gotten anywhere closer to making it clearer to you why I believe Jorjani's thinking isn't going far enough, that he hasn't accounted for everything that needs to be accounted for in order to establish his position that all there is his third substance. Okay, that's it for this one. I will attempt to explain how my position relates to ethics in the next video, but it will probably come towards the second half of that next video.